is on the tradition of hydroplane racing around Vashon, presented by Brian Brenno. Welcome to the Vashon Heritage Museum History Talks. This talk is a partnership between the Vashon Heritage Museum and the Senior Center. And we also want to recognize and thank our sponsors for culture. Now let's introduce our speaker. Brian Brenno is a fourth-generation Islander who grew up hearing stories about Vashon from his father and grandfather, both business owners in the town of Vashon. He's the author of the recently released book, Town of Vashon, 1890 to 1960, past president of the Vashon Heritage Museum, a co-curator of the 2011 exhibit Main Street Vashon, a Vashon history buff, and the owner of Brian Brenno Glass. Brian, welcome.
Hi.
Thank you for being here, and tell us about the traditions of hydros on Vashon Island.
Okay, so this tradition has a long history, and I think I've been studying and putting a book together about it because I grew up on the beach near where this all began, and it's part of my island heritage. And as I went through the history of it, I realized that that's really what it's all about. It's about guys who like to wrench on things and go fast and honor the island heritage. So I'm going to start out by kind of explaining the conditions that made kind of set up to make this happen. Part of that's hydroplane history. Part of that's kind of the history of the Seattle area, which was quite different back when this all started. So we're going to start out with the heritage of boat racing on Vashon. So in 1905, two steamboat captains that had a steamboat that went to Tacoma from Quartermaster Harbor had a bitter breakup, Chance Wyman and Frank Bibbins. They subsequently each built their own steamboat and went into direct competition with each other from Quartermaster Harbor to Tacoma. The races were legendary. People were knocked off docks. I mean, clams were thrown at people. This started a tradition of boat racing on Vashon. And I want you to remember that name Bibbins because it will come up later as part of the basis for the heritage of this whole event. So another thing is Gold Cup racing and hydroplanes. So the Gold Cup is the oldest active trophy in motorsports. Started in 1904. It was very popular. And around 1911, they instead of having flat bottoms holes, they came up with this idea of a step. So the bottom of the boat goes and has a little step up, and it's allowed a little air to get trapped in there and allowed the boat to get up out of the water and on a plane, and it allowed them to go faster. Well, Gold Cup racing was hugely popular in the United States. It all was based on the East Coast, out of Detroit and New York. And as things progressed up to World War II, they started using big airplane engines, and these boats went really fast, and it was quite popular throughout the country. So in 1905, Carmen Waterman built an outboard engine called the Waterman Porto there on the left. It was the first outboard motor. 1909, Evinrude built an outboard motor. This made it possible for your average Joe to buy a little motor, have a little boat, and speed around. He didn't have to buy a big, they're portable. And so this guy, Craig Fajali, wrote, he was a hydro and racing historian. He wrote, a variation on the advertising adage applies to outboard racing. If you build it, they'll race it. So these little motors allowed guys to get little old flat bottom rowboats and race around. In 1927, the speed at 26 miles an hour, woo, was registered by a guy in Seattle. And the Seattle Outboard Association started in 1929. There's events held in Green Lake. They used rowboats and these little motors with tillers, and they started racing. So around 1929, it got really popular in the United States. And S.V.D. Miller wrote a good description of why it was so popular. He wrote, "In my humble estimation, the wonderful popularity of outboard motors is due to their small initial cost and low running expense, coupled with the fact that many models are conveniently portable and a trailer can be purchased which will tow boat and motor behind a car almost anywhere." So that's what happened. Especially, like I said, with guys who maybe their guy had a hot rod in his garage and liked to wrench on things, or drove motorcycles, or these guys, there's always, especially coming out of the service after World War II, these guys were into racing and building and wrenching on things and going fast. So that was kind of a tradition of outboard racing that started in the 20s and continued on. In 1928, the first kind of marathon race was developed up the Sammamish Slough. And this was unusual because most of these little outboard race boats, they'll race on like a 3/4 mile track and maybe do 3 laps and then done, and they'll do several heats. They're really not built to go long distances. They run at the highest RPM possible. It's really hard on the engines. And so there's not many marathon races, but this one, for these little boats, but this one was a tradition on the Sammamish Slough until 1976. I remember going to this race several times and watching these boats fly up the Sammamish Slough under bridges and around cow pastures. Well, in 76, a boat flew off the water and hit somebody and broke his leg, and he sued. And because this was sanctioned and sponsored, the event folded because they just couldn't afford the insurance and just keeping it going. So I want to remember that too. This sanctioning eventually made this storied race. And so in 1929, the first mention of speedboat racing on Vashon comes from the Vashon Island News Record. They reported that the local boat Baby, owned by Don Morgan, piloted by Earl Watson and Bob Weiss, was one of the entrants in Seattle Olympia outboard marathon race. The boys reported that the water was the roughest they had ever experienced. At times, the Baby, propeller and all, was completely out of the water as it breasted 5-foot waves. They didn't mind those jumps, but 15 to 20 feet was going just a bit too strong. They reported the Baby was leading the race when near the finish line, it hit a piece of driftwood and sheared a pin on the propeller. While fixing the problem, it was passed by the eventual winner, Jimmy Tregongan. Once fixed, the Baby came in second. Well, here's the Seattle Times article about Jimmy Tregongan. I don't know if I'm saying the name right. And so around that time, the Billingsley family were living on Quartermaster Harbor, and in 1929, they completed a 150-foot dock, which still stands in Quartermaster Harbor along Quartermaster Drive. And the Island News Record reported that they had a yacht, 2 speedboats, Duck Soup, CB, and another speedboat called another speedboat. So during my research and all this, I remembered the Billingsley family home movies, which have been passed around the island to different people that are interested in that history. And so I pulled out this clip. This is, you'll see the Billingsley dock, and I'll kind of talk you through what's going on. So they really started another tradition of water sports and boat racing on Quartermaster Harbor. So here's Mrs. Billingsley walking down the dock, and you'll see the dock and their yacht, and you're looking towards Burton right there. And now you're going to see what's called, they'll be doing what's called, they call this surfboarding, and it's basically early wakeboarding. This is behind their yacht, which made quite big waves. This is a young fella who, the young Paul Billingsley went to military school with this guy. He came up to visit, he was really muscly and stuff, and they started doing this. And behind you, you'll see this is in Quartermaster Harbor. So this really started a tradition of water sports on the harbor. You get this is young Paul Billingsley. You'll see at the end here, he'll go all the way back, and then he's going to go with the rope in his mouth, like, look, Ma, no hands. These old home movies are really a gem. There's lots of little shots of different Vashons. So if you see behind you there, that's along Kingsbury, what we call Kingsbury Beach. This was probably about 1931. And as they come around the corner here, you're going to see the Burton Peninsula, and then we'll look into Burton as they make the corner. They would also do this behind their speedboats. And here is Paul Billingsley Sr. giving it a try, and you'll see it doesn't last very long until he falls. Another way they do it for the younger people is they hook the rope right to the like a piece of plywood and put a little V rope up that the kids could hold on to and pull around. And this is really popular. I remember doing this before I learned to water ski as a kid up into the 60s. Now, Paul Billingsley Jr. had this boat called Duck Soup, and this is Lake Sammamish. He raced this boat at Lake Sammamish, in Bellingham, and a little bit around the circuits. And they also have this boat called the CB2, and this is Joy Billingsley, his sister, and they would bomb around in the harbor in CB2 and in his other boat, Duck Soup. And they also raced. Joy also did a bit of racing, at least a few times. I know she raced in a borrowed boat on Lake Sammamish once. And so, you know, this started a tradition of speedboats on the harbor. Their neighbor, Bert Stanley, built a little step hydro, and the news record reported that in 1930, Bert Stanley came in violent contact with a floating stick, followed by a plunge into the briny deep. He was trying out the fine new boat he recently built and was going to the limit. When rescued, the boat was in reverse position and Mr. Stanley was purchased aloft. So these guys started this tradition. Remember that name Stanley, because that'll become important in the, that's Bert Stanley right there in Billingsley's boat CB. That's would be Quartermaster Drive kind of area behind, I believe. So now we move up to the 1940s and the modern hydro. So they had the step hydro design where it was just a little step in the bottom. Then they started adding these, you see in the front of this boat has little pontoons. They started adding these pontoons and they called them a 3-point hydro. So they would, the air would kind of go underneath and the boat would ride up higher and it would ride just on the back of the boat and the back of the two front sponsons. So along came a guy named Ted Jones, and he was a Seattle guy, worked at Boeing, was a Boeing designer and engineer, really into hydros and boats, and he started playing around with that sponson system and came up with something a little bit different that eventually revolutionized hydro design. So he talked about it. He said, after tearing off and rebuilding sponsons 13 times, I finally had them where I wanted them. It was through this trial and error that I learned that the angle of attack of sponson drives the boat out of the water into the correct planing angle, and then as speeds increase, the air pressure takes over and sports the weight of the boat. So what his hydroplane would do is it would go up and it would just, the ends of the sponsons back would just touch and just the propeller, so his boat was basically flying. Well, he took his boat that he designed for Stan Sayers, a Seattle car dealer, to the Gold Cup in 1950. And he broke the speed record. He broke, he won the Gold Cup. He won another thing called the Harmsworth Cup, all within like 3 months, and totally revolutionized hydroplane racing and made it really exciting for people in Seattle, because the reality is when you win the Gold Cup, you get to take the race home. This is the first time ever the Gold Cup had left Detroit or gone west of Detroit. It was a huge deal, and it really rocked Seattle. So another part of leading up to this whole hydroplane thing is this hydroplane Gold Cup movement in Seattle and just what Seattle was like. It was a totally different place back then. So I'm going to just do a little description of Seattle in the 50s. So its economy was based on natural resources, Weyerhaeuser, and other timber companies. Manufacturing boomed with Boeing. There's maritime industries from fishing to supply chains, Alaska and worldwide. Businesses served a growing population, includes the ones we shop at today, like Nordstrom's, Bartell's. The Smith Tower was the only high-rise. The old part of the city consisted of buildings built in 1889 after the fire. The Pike Lake Market was a working market, not a tourist attraction. Skid Row area, First Avenue from Market to Pioneer Square, was a body street of strip clubs and bars. There were no freeways other than the Alaska Way Viaduct, which was completed in '49. No high-rise bridge to West Seattle, no I-5, no Space Needle, no Seattle Center, no high-tech companies, no internet. It was just a rough and tumble working class city way away from the centers of industry and stuff in the East. And then there was really no sports in Seattle. We had a minor league team, baseball team. We had the UW football team, but the top of sports after 1950 was Ted Jones. And it captivated everybody in Seattle. And Roger Stanley talked about how he said it was like a ghost town. Everybody was at the lake, up to 550,000 people. All the drivers from the era were all individual, and you had your favorite driver, but you felt you knew him personally. When Slow-Mo did a famous flip, one time it flipped and landed upright, everybody just went nuts. And he says there's nothing like it to be at the lake. And that continued into my generation. Kids would make these little plywood hydroplanes and tow them behind bicycles and boats, and they'd identify with racers. And the Gold Cup was really huge up into probably in the 80s. It started filling up, but it stayed one of the most popular sports in Seattle for many years. So we have that in the 50s, this big surge of hydro popularity. And it gave young men the urge to have a little hydro and go fast. So Science and Mechanics magazine, one of the editors, William Jackson, designed this Mini-Max hydro you see on the left. A family could probably build that in a weekend with basically one sheet of plywood, throw a little motor on it, and go out and buzz around in a little hydro and have fun. Well, enter two young men from Vashon Island, Roger Stanley and Warren Bibbins. So you see this hydro on the right, that was built by Warren Bibbins in high school, at the high school shop when he was in high school. You'll notice what really turns me on about this little hydro, it didn't go fast, it wasn't a very good design, but that steering wheel is all made from cut out of plywood. Warren made this handmade steering wheel. Anyway, so these two guys, Warren Bibbins and Roger Stanley. Roger Stanley, you heard his name before. His dad, Bert Stanley, was that tradition of little speedboats on the harbor. You heard the Bibbins name. His grandfather, Frank Bibbins, raced steamboats. So these two guys had these little hydros, and they buzz around. One day in 1955, Stanley, it was a beautiful day, and he said, well, I'm just going to throw some extra gas in my boat and go around the island. So this was the first time the hydro went around the island. Roger Stanley, 1955, he said, I had a little B-stock hydro with a Mark 20 motor. It wasn't very competitive. The engine wasn't great, but the boat really didn't have it. It wasn't a good design, but he bombed around the harbor and eventually went around the island for the first time. So that was basically the seed of the possibility that it could be done, run around the island. So in 1958, Roger Stanley in the plaid there, that's Paul Stoddard, who also was involved in the hydros later. Roger bought this hydro, seen in the picture, designed and built by legendary Ted Jones. Brought it back to the island. He would bomb around the harbor in it. And the next summer, right around that time, Warren Bibbins bought this Carlson hydro from the Shade brothers, who lived in Newport, just south of Burton Bridge. and Roger would bomb around the harbor. And Roger and Warren, Roger Stanley ended up in the 60s racing on the circuit. He'd take his hydro, load it on the back of his pickup or back of his car and haul it off to Canada, California, and did some racing. One of his favorite tricks was Roger Stanley. This is him and Warren's hydro. He would go under the Billingsley's dock and then under the long dock here at about 70 miles an hour. He'd just go flying through there. Everyone else was pretty much afraid to do that, though I did see Ty Christopherson do it a couple of years ago. Anyway, so they would bomb around, they leave the hydros on the raft and bomb around, just putt around and play around with them all summer. So it was also the heritage of water sports continued. This is legendary Vashon artist Jack Tabor. It's not in Quartermaster Harbor, it's on the West Pass, but Norm Stanley is credited with bringing the water skiing to Vashon. They bought some old tennis shoes and nailed them to some boards. Water skiing started in the 20s, but it really didn't become popular, especially around here, till later when the engines got strong enough to pull people. So they started water skiing in the harbor in the 50s. My mom learned, she was a summer girl on the harbor, and she learned to water ski with Norm Stanley. So did my dad. This is Rod Spencer, who actually skied behind the Browns plane here. He's held on until the plane was ready to take off, and then it was too fast for him, and he let go. This is from the 1950s. So another trick they used to do, one skier, this is Roger Stanley driving Warren Bibbins Hydro and Warren Bibbins skiing. I experienced this several times. We pull someone behind Warren Bibbins ski boat. The hydro would go by, they'd throw out the line, the skier would grab that, let go of the speedboat, and go behind the hydro and ski at about 70 miles an hour. So, there's this in the harbor, this fun, people bombing around in boats, good fun stuff happening. And around 1958, 57, it had been a tradition for these two guys, Stanley and Bibbins, on New Year's and the 4th of July to blow off dynamite. New Year's, they blow it off in the middle of the harbor. Same thing, they were really into fireworks, they were noisy. So they were told to stop, especially the New Year's Eve one. They by their elders, they were warned you shouldn't do it. Well, they weren't so happy about that, I assume. So apparently they devised a plan, okay, let's take our hydros out on New Year's morning. Well, these little hydros have to have flat calm water. So this is one of the reasons they either go out when they're practicing, usually in the evening when the water's flat calm, and they do their run on the 4th of July and other times in early morning when it's flat calm. So they went out New Year's morning, they say 1958, and ran around the harbor and woke everybody up because they weren't able to light off their dynamite the night before. So that's the legend of actually how it got started. So after that, around 1960, Stanley and Bibbins they'd leave their boats on the raft like this, and the other boat is Roger Compton, who joined them soon after. And on 4th of July, they'd get up and go. Previously on the 4th of July, they'd put towboats out in the middle of the harbor and blow them up and stuff. And this was a little more toned down. Still kind of, I think the idea that they're pranking people going out in the morning appealed to them too. So starting in 1958 was pretty much every 4th of July, Roger and Warren would go out. They were soon joined by Roger Compton. Now Roger Compton's mother was Joy Billingsley, so he has a direct family heritage of boat racing, and he joined them in the 60s. Paul Stoddard, another longtime Island family, he joined him back then too. Paul, he attempted like 20-something times. He made it around twice and won once. So this race, this run is really hard in these boats, and there's always a lot of breakdowns, and it's always a challenge. So starting in 1973, the race, there were some new people with boats, some young guys that got boats, and they moved the start stop to Jensen Point. And they showed up in 1973 to a Coast Guard cutter and cops. So 1973 starts the Beachcomber coverage of this event. The Beachcombers pretty much covered this event non-stop since then. So I'm just going to read part of this Beachcomber report so you can hear what happened. So it says 13 years hydros have made the informal tradition of circling the island early in the morning with flags fluttering, starting Independence Day celebration. But this year's, with 5 hydros and 3 ski boats ready to go, the Coast Guard and County Police waited for them with advice that they'd better stay out of the water. So the cops said they weren't registered, they didn't have a permit, they would be fined if they did. So they didn't do it. This is one of the few times the event was stopped. But a week later, they did it. They said, screw it, we're going to do it anyway. So they went on a week later, and they all were cited. So I think 3 of them got tickets for noise. And they paid the tickets and continued on. But after that, they had to get a permit. So what happened was the JCs were running festival, Strawberry Festival, sponsored the event, and they got insurance and a permit, so everything was legal. It's still, noise ordinance was waived because they had a permit. So this continued. This event was nominally sponsored and permitted until about the mid-90s. And then they hadn't been hassled. The JCs and everybody dropped sponsorship. So it's basically just 3 or 4 guys. They show up on the 4th of July and go. And it's never been sponsored or monetized or anything. And then in 1996, the Beachcomber reported that more than 100 spectators were at Jensen Point. King County Police received a number of complaints about early morning race. They didn't cite anybody, but people are up in arms because of the noise. So this is a recurring thing. The enforcement for the ordinances comes out of the Marine Division of King County Police, which is based in Des Moines. They've stated that they don't like the fact that these guys run without a permit or insurance, but they have too many other busy, they can't just come out here for this, especially on the 4th of July. So it's kind of, since the mid-90s, it's just been kind of this outlaw quote event, you know, and it's really dwindled down during those years to just 3 or 4 boats, and guys throw them in the water and go. So here's an official entry bank back when it was sanctioned. So we started getting, in the 70s, guys like me, my age, started getting involved. Chris Van Buskirk was an early one. He grew up in the neighborhood there with Roger and Warren and me, and hung out in the raft, and Warren and Roger were like mentors and helped them build motors and put stuff together, kind of continuing this tradition and heritage of hydros and speedboats on the island. Another younger, Ricky Oliver and Dave Long, came along just behind my generation. Ricky Oliver was the youngest winner. He won at age 13. This is Warren Bibbins lifting him into the boat that morning, 1980. He went with Tom DeFazio as a co-pilot riding him back because Ricky didn't have the weight, and they were much more comfortable with 2 guys in the boat. And it's kind of, you know, it's kind of scary now. Some people, wow, you put your 13-year-old in the boat to go around the island? These kids were taught really well and mentored by Warren Bibbins. They had practice sessions. They were taught how to do proper boating and what to look for in waves and stuff. And I guess the parents felt it was all right. I think this is cute. This is the map that Ricky drew so he remembered the points and where to go when he went around the island. So this is another hydro taking off. It's another kid. I think this is Tom Long taking off that same year. Drew Carr, another neighbor of Stanley's, young guy my age, got into hydros. He ran for many years, won a couple times. It's Larry Fuller in the back, another longtime Islander who has been involved in racing. This is Ron Hills. He worked with Chris Van Buskirk driving truck, and him and Todd Gateman and Eric Wolf and some guys like that got interested. These are all guys who like to wrench on things and are involved, you know, the mechanics and stuff, and carried on this island tradition. Kids, families are very involved. This is Shelby Van Buskirk and her dad's boat, and Shelby and Haley Hills in dad's boat. It's passed on, the love of them, and just hanging out as a real family kind of deal. Jenny Stoddard in the parade holding up the perpetual trophy in the, I think, 80s. So then comes along the annual 3rd July all-night party. And this kind of plagued the event for many years. I know my parents lived on Quartermaster Harbor, and after my involvement in the 3rd July party, and I was older and we'd spend the night always with my parents, these guys would keep us up all night long. But it basically started with me and my friends around 1972, partied all night down at Warren's Beach before him and Roger took off. And, you know, we were in late middle school and turned into high school, and our friends would gather out to some party, and it turned into this huge, out of control, even to me, thing. And I'm going to read a little blurb from the Beachcomber in 2012 when it was at its height of stupidness. So it says, Sheriff Office threatens to end holiday race. Participants say they hope to make the race legal next year. Oh, wait. Oh, no, that's, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, you guys, I lost that. So anyway, the Beachcomber is complaining that all these crazy people and kids and drunks, I mean, it was disgusting, in my opinion, at the end, we're going to ruin this event. Well, somehow around 2006, it all just died out. More and more yachters would come from off island into the harbor, and they got mad, and it just died out. And that, luckily, this ugly part of the 4th of July tradition died out. So Ted Jones moved to Vashon, wow, in the 90s, and had a big impact on the 4th of July run. This boat up in the top left was a little tunnel boat. It's won 2 times the run, especially on days when it was really windy and rough. This boat can handle that. The top right is Chris Van and Earl Van Buskirk's tunnel boat that they had a 454 Chev in. I rode in this boat several times. Amazed me. We left my parents' house in Quartermaster Drive by Judd Creek, made it to Commencement Bay at Foss Waterway in 8 minutes and 23 seconds or something like that. The bottom left is Jim Beal's boat. This has been a chase boat, following the hydros around to make sure everyone's safe for many years. And then Todd Gateman bought a Ron Jones designed, I believe, and Ted and Ron Jones built hydro. And he had a great story. He told me he was out practicing off Dockton when he first got it, and it wasn't going very fast, so he pulled into the beach, and there's a big Cadillac there, the guy smoking a cigar, and the guy said, "Hey, I designed that boat, we designed that boat for somebody 20-pound lighter. If you move that prop back a little bit, you'll go faster." It was Ted Jones. So he became a friend and mentor to all the racers through the 80s and until he passed in the 90s. So this is Ted and Roger. This is Ted signing Todd's boat after Todd won one year. So from then on, from 1986 to now, we've had a lot of, Islanders, like I say, carrying on this tradition and, experience their Vashon heritage. And we've, there's 45 or more people that have run this race as racers, and countless others that count on it every year, and it's part of their island tradition. Here's little Michael Arbethal. Kids love and hate that noise. So I've been Paul Stoddard did the timing and did everybody's time for years. When he passed away, I took over the job. his Mickey Mouse clock, and now I've been for since 2007 or so, just kind of keeping the records. I'm working on compiling everything, and I'm making a little book about it someday in the future. Maybe next year we'll have that. Here's Carl Olson, who's been involved since the early 2000s. His father-in-law, Larry Fuller, has been involved for years, and now you see Carlson Thomas in the hydro. Ty Christopherson, he grew up on Quartermaster Harbor near Bibbins and Stanley, part of that heritage and tradition. He's been involved for since the 2000s. Evan Mattingly, his younger brother, or older brother, pardon me, ran in it, and then Ryan's been running in most of the 2000s. Paul Hoffman, so you can see Paul's boat, he flipped it off of the ferry dock in 2015, I believe. And you know, this stuff happens. A lot of guys have come in on ropes, beached their boats, flipped their boats, no huge major injuries, a couple broken bones maybe. Somebody fell out of that white tunnel boat one year, and luckily it circled around and came back, and he crawled back in it. I won't mention the name. Anyway, so that's been the tradition, and it's passed on. Now we got Evan and Ron Hills. Ron ran in the 80s, and now his son Evan's running. Chris Van Buskirk passed it on to his kid, Mitch, another second generation driver, and they'll be out there tomorrow morning. I believe there's going to be 8, maybe 9 hydros, which is up from 3 in previous recent years. Tony Bianchi's a recent, he won last year and broke the record, time record. So that's my presentation. Now I'm just going to run you a short little video so you can kind of experience what it's like on 4th of July morning, and then I'll take some questions. All right, so any questions?
Hi, Brian. So, yeah, everyone, please put your questions in chat. Let's talk about some of this. If you have any questions, Roger Stanley is here, by the way, Brian. He says,
hey, Roger.
And
see you tomorrow morning. Hope I got it right.
And also,
Roger was a big help to me. I sat down one afternoon, and we just talked for hours and hours and hours. He told me the whole story, and it was really awesome.
Well, and also Don Curtis says
Hey,
good.
cousin Don.
Okay, good stuff, Brian. Next best thing to being there. Now questions and comments are coming in. Just wanted to say this talk has been cool. That's Mary Toole. And what time does the race start tomorrow?
Well, usually about 5:40, 5:30, right about daybreak.
Yeah, well, here's a question. Why do you think there's so much new interest in racing since we're up to 8 boats from 3 boats?
It has directly to do with these guys' heritage. You have, you know, 2 guys whose dads did it, and you have their buddies who grew up with it, and maybe their dads and their family weren't in racing, but they went there every 4th of July. They grew up with it. And most of these, they're young guys that are coming on, and they got jobs, and they, you know, they can afford to get the toys and play with them. And it's been really invigorating, you know, to see the interest continue, because it really is kind of a heritage thing on the island.
Karen Fuller says no questions, but thanks from Larry and Karen.
Hey, Karen.
And see you tomorrow.
Yep.
So someone wants to know, actually Bruce Holman wants to know, Brian, when will you start racing?
When will I? No. I grew up on Warren Bibbin's raft, and I was the water skier. I always had the water ski boat, and I was the water skier. Chris Van Buskirk and Drew Carr, they were the hydro guys, and Ricky Oliver. So I always had the water ski boat, and now I'm a little old to be kneeling down for 45 minutes going around beating my body around the island. I would have loved to. I got to drive Chris Van Buskirk's hydro. I got on his needle nose and Drew's. You know, I got to do it when I was younger. So never did it though.
So I want to ask the question. It still is not. So the race is not promoted by anyone. Is the race promoted by anyone? Sponsored by anyone?
No. It was sponsored by, like I said, by the JCs and the Strawberry Festival for many years, in 70s to 90s, I think. And then they stopped. I think when the Chamber took over the festival, Chamber of Commerce, JC stopped sponsoring it, and no one I think that's what saved it, though. If you were sanctioned, you know, you'd have, you know, all these pressures, and it's basically just a few guys that go out and I think what pisses people off, makes people mad more than anything, is when they're out practicing at like 8 o'clock at night and for a couple hours. 4th of July morning, it's just boom, boom, it's over, roll over, go back to sleep.
So could you, Brian, could you talk about Roger Stanley's boat and getting it put into the museum possibly?
Now that Roger, we would really like to do that. This boat is not only is it legendary because it was designed and built by Ted Jones, it's legendary because Roger Stanley started this whole tradition, and it's the all-time leader of winning. And it's a cool hydro, it's a cool artifact. The museum also would like to display a Larson Marine boat, a skipper craft. And, you know, it's in our plans, at least when I was involved in the board, is we would love to work with people like me that are interested in the hydros to build at least like an outdoor building behind the museum to house maybe some farm equipment, Rogers Hydro, and some boat stuff. So, you know, I'm assuming that hopefully that'll become a long-range plan, but we don't want to let that hydro sit out under a tarp for too long, because, you know, it's a very important artifact on this island. I mean, that's a 60-year some tradition. And it's such a cool object to look at too.
So would Roger Stanley be open to having the museum,
That's definitely expressed interest in it. He would rather, he doesn't want to sell it to somebody who doesn't understand what it really is and the importance of it. And he doesn't want to run it anymore, and he would like the museum to have it, is what he expressed to Bruce and I.
Okay.
Well, that's one of my goals in the future.
Is the Museum of Flight on a marginal way is in Seattle.
Oh,
is that the one you're looking for?
So, Brian, Roger Federley says, good job. And do you have a list of all of the winners?
I do. I have a list of all the winners and all the participants that I'm aware of. For, like I said, I think it's 45 participants on my list. And, you know, I have from 1973 till 2019 as far as records and who won. There's a couple of years where it didn't get, they didn't do it because the weather was bad, or once it got stopped because of the cops. So yeah, I got all that. And I'm like I said, I'm putting it together in a book. I was hoping to get it out this year, but it just didn't happen. I got to have so many photos that people have contributed. I got to kind of make sure I can use them all and put it all together. But I have documented pretty much what I showed you, and some great photos and all the records and all the Beachcomber, a synopsis of all the Beachcomber reports.
I'm looking for more questions.
I'm looking at my family assembled for the 4th of July party here in the yard. My daughter's here, my niece, my nephew. Don, Curtis, we miss you.
So will everyone tomorrow be wear masks and
good question. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know. I have a cool old K2 scarf I might wear. Okay. I feel like when I'm outdoors and I can position myself where I'm not going to be, but I don't know. That's a question. Okay. I wanted a red, white, and blue one, but I couldn't find one.
Well, you'll have to document that for our archives.
Yeah, I will. That's a good point, because
thank you.
You know, yeah, I've been
hydros in the time of COVID.
I drove by the theater recently, and there's like 20, 30 people standing out there with masks on. I just had to pull over and take a picture because it's pandemic. I mean, it's like, document that.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Brian. This was a wonderful talk, really great pictures and video, and I really appreciate it, and wish you and everybody a happy happy and safe 4th of July. And remind everybody of our next talk on the Vashon festivals, July 17th. And we're approaching our hour, so we can say goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. See
Thanks, Brian.
Tomorrow morning. My alarm's set for 4. Bye.
Bye.